And he was very rough on me. I was used to moving all over the place, doing all this, and he would say, "Shut." He made me do it 48 times, and I did it.
There was a time when a single glance from Bette Davis could silence a room. But behind those unforgettable eyes lived a story far quieter and far more complicated. In her later years, long after the applause had faded and the cameras had turned away, she began to look back, not at the roles, not at the awards, but at the people she had loved and the ones she had lost. Some stayed, some didn't, and one never truly left her. This is not just the story of her marriages or even her affairs. It is the story of a woman who searched for something she could never quite hold on to, and the question she carried almost to the very end: who was the love of her life? And in the end, the man she loved most was never the one she married. Before we look at the men she loved, I want to hear from you. If you had to choose just one, is it the fire of All About Eve or the defiant passion of Jezebel? Drop your favorite in the comments. I'll be hearting the best answers as we dive into her true story, the marriage that fame slowly destroyed. Before the world knew her name, she gave her loyalty to a man who would quietly lose her, as the world began to claim her. In the early 1930s, Bette Davis was not yet a legend. She was simply a young woman trying to find her place in a city that offered very little certainty. It was during this fragile beginning that she married Harmon O. Nelson in 1932. At the time, the choice made sense. He represented something steady in a life that felt anything but. And for a while, that was enough. But ambition has a way of rewriting everything. As her career slowly began to take shape, something inside her sharpened. Small roles became larger ones. Directors started to notice her intensity. The industry, slowly but undeniably, began to open its doors. And with that, the balance between them began to shift. What once felt like support started to feel like distance. What once felt like partnership began to feel uneven. Because the woman he had married was changing. Not in who she was, but in who she was becoming. There are moments in life when growth brings people closer, and there are moments when it quietly pulls them apart. By the mid-1930s, the silence between them had grown heavier than any argument. The connection they once shared could no longer keep pace with the life she was stepping into. By 1938, the marriage ended. No dramatic collapse, no final confrontation, just the quiet understanding that she was moving forward, and he was no longer part of that future. And for the first time, Bette Davis felt the cost of becoming someone the world would remember, the man who challenged her like no other. By the late 1930s, everything had begun to change for Bette Davis. She was no longer fighting to be seen. Now she was fighting to be understood. It was during this time, while filming Jezebel, that she met the man who would challenge her in ways no one else ever had, William Wyler. From the very beginning, their connection was different. Wyler was demanding, precise, uncompromising. He pushed her again and again, asking for more takes, more control, more emotional truth. At times, it frustrated her. At times, it angered her. But beneath that tension, something else was forming: respect. And for a woman like Davis, that mattered more than affection. For perhaps the first time, she found herself standing across from a man she could not easily overpower. Someone who saw through her strength and demanded even more from it. Their collaboration turned into something electric. Every scene carried weight. Every glance felt real. And somewhere between the long shooting days and quiet moments in between, their connection became deeply personal. Not loud, not openly declared, but undeniably present. Still, it was never simple. Wyler was married. The timing was wrong, and the world they lived in did not allow for easy choices. So what existed between them? was never fully lived, and perhaps that was exactly why it lasted. Years later, Davis would reflect on that time with a kind of quiet honesty, suggesting that her life might have been very different had things turned out another way. Some loves are built in reality, others are built in possibility, and sometimes it is the ones we never get to live that stay with us the longest. The love that gave her peace, then took it away. In the early 1940s, after the intensity and emotional complexity of her connection with William Wyler, something in Bette Davis began to shift. She no longer seemed drawn to challenge, not to tension, not to unfinished feelings. This time, she chose peace. That peace came in the form of Arthur Farnsworth. He was not part of Hollywood, not a director, not an actor, not a man chasing recognition. He was quiet, grounded, real, and perhaps for the first time in her life, Davis stepped into a relationship that did not demand performance. They married in 1940. Away from the noise of the industry, their life together carried a different rhythm, slower, calmer, more certain. For a woman who had spent years fighting to prove herself, that kind of stability was not just comforting, it was necessary. With Farnsworth, she could simply be. No competition, no emotional battles, just something steady. But life rarely holds on to peace for long. In 1943, everything changed. Farnsworth collapsed and died suddenly, following complications linked to a head injury. The loss was abrupt, unresolved, final in a way that left no space for understanding, only silence. And for Davis, that silence lingered. The life she had just begun to build disappeared almost overnight. There was no gradual ending, no chance to prepare, only absence. Those who knew her would later say that something shifted after that moment. Not outwardly, she remained strong, driven, composed, but inwardly, something closed. The woman who had finally found peace had also learned how quickly it could be taken away, and from that point on, love would never feel quite the same again. The marriage that could not hold her spirit. By the mid-1940s, life had already asked a great deal from Bette Davis. She had known ambition. She had known loss. And now, quietly, she was trying to begin again. It was during this period that she married William Grant Sherry. On the surface, it seemed like a step forward, a new chapter, a chance to rebuild something that had been taken from her too soon. In 1947, she gave birth to her daughter, Barbara, known as B.D. Harmon, and for a time, that role, motherhood, became one of the most meaningful parts of her life. But even in moments of happiness, something underneath remained unsettled. Because this marriage was not built on the same quiet foundation she had once found, Sherry was not a man who could meet her where she stood, not in strength, not in presence, and not in the kind of emotional balance she needed. And Davis was not a woman who could make herself smaller to make a relationship work. There are times in life when love asks for compromise, and there are times when compromise becomes something else entirely. As the years passed, the differences between them became harder to ignore. The relationship began to feel uneven, one side carrying more weight than the other. And for someone who had already learned how fragile peace could be, that imbalance was impossible to overlook. By the end of the decade, the marriage came to an end. Not with the sharp pain of sudden loss, but with the quiet understanding that it was never truly right. And perhaps, without saying it out loud, Bette Davis was beginning to realize something deeper. Not every love fails because it ends. Some fail because they were never strong enough to begin with. The love that slowly turned into conflict. By the time Bette Davis met Gary Merrill, something felt, at last, aligned. Not quieter, not easier, but equal. They came together during All About Eve, surrounded by long hours, sharp dialogue, and the kind of creative pressure that usually pulled people apart. With them, it did the opposite. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable to anyone else, when Merrill reportedly stayed beside her between takes, not speaking, just present, as if he understood that silence was sometimes the only thing she needed. For a woman who had spent years being challenged, misunderstood, or left alone in her strength, that kind of presence mattered. They married that same year, and for a while, it worked. He wasn't intimidated by her success. He moved within her world, not against it. But closeness can reveal what distance hides. Over time, the balance began to shift. Not in public, but behind closed doors. Merrill could be warm, attentive, and then suddenly distant, restless, at times unsteady in ways that were difficult to predict. And Davis, who had built her life on control, found herself in something she could not steady. That was the contradiction. She had chosen a man who seemed to understand her strength, only to find herself carrying the weight of the relationship once again. The connection didn't break all at once. It wore down, slowly, quietly, until what once felt like partnership began to feel like strain. By the end of the decade, the marriage was over. And perhaps what made it harder was not how it ended, but how, for a moment, it had almost felt right. The men who came close but never stayed. Not every connection in Bette Davis's life was defined by marriage. Some were quieter, less documented, but no less revealing. During the late 1930s and into the 1940s, between major turning points in her life, there were men who entered her world briefly, leaving behind moments that never fully became something more. One of them was George Brent. They appeared together on screen multiple times, their chemistry unmistakable. Audiences noticed it. Studios relied on it. And somewhere within that professional closeness, there were whispers of something more personal. But whatever existed between them never fully took shape. Perhaps the timing was never right. Or perhaps neither of them was willing to step beyond what was already understood. Then there was Howard Hughes, a man known for his fascination with powerful, complex women. His interest in Davis was real, but brief, and like so many connections in her life, it did not last. Because by this point, something within her had already been shaped by everything that came before. The early disappointment, the unfinished intensity, the peace she had lost. All of it had quietly rewritten what she needed and what she would no longer accept. These were not great loves. They were moments, possibilities that never fully formed. And perhaps that was the pattern. Men came close. Some understood her. Some were drawn to her strength. But staying was something else entirely. Because loving Bette Davis was never simple. And by the time these connections came into her life, she was no longer searching for something temporary. She had already known what real love felt like, and she had already lost it. The love she never fully let go of. In the later years of her life, when the noise of Hollywood had faded into memory, Bette Davis found herself surrounded not by scripts, but by reflection. The roles were behind her. The applause had quieted. What remained were the people she had loved. And the question that never quite left her, if you looked at her life from the outside, the answer seemed simple. There was Arthur Farnsworth, the man who gave her peace, the one who offered her a life away from pressure, away from expectation. The man she chose and lost too soon. That was the love she lived. But there was another name, William Wyler, the man who challenged her, the man who saw her not just as a star, but as something deeper. With him, there had been no quiet life, no simple stability, only intensity, respect, and something that was never fully allowed to become real. And perhaps that is why it never faded. Years later, she would reflect on that time with a kind of honesty that revealed more than she intended. suggesting that her life might have taken a very different shape had she chosen him, or had he chosen her. It was not a declaration, not a confession, but it was enough, because some loves are remembered for what they gave us, and others for what they never had the chance to become. For Bette Davis, the answer was never simple. There was the life she lived, with Arthur Farnsworth, where love was quiet, real, and heartbreakingly brief. And there was the life she never lived, with William Wyler, where love remained unfinished, unresolved, and perhaps untouched by time. She carried both, not as choices, but as truths. And in the end, the roles faded, the applause disappeared, but the question remained: was it better to have loved deeply or to have wondered forever? In the end, the life of Bette Davis was not just defined by the roles she played, but by the loves she carried with her. Some gave her strength, some took it away, and one never truly found its place in reality. She had known peace, she had known passion, but perhaps what stayed with her the longest was not what she had, but what she almost had. And maybe that is what makes her story feel so familiar, even now, because, in one way or another, we all remember the love that changed us, and the one we never quite let go. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video, and subscribe for more timeless stories from Hollywood's golden age. There are still many truths left to uncover.